Accepting a simple favor almost cost me my life, and it left me with lasting consequences that still affect me when I try to sleep. I suffer from frequent nightmares, waking up with a racing heart, screaming, or sometimes saying random things, like asking for help or fleeing from something unknown. For a while, my parents had been calling me, asking for help finding them a new house to move into. According to them, the house they had recently purchased was haunted by the demon, Lucifer, and other names that were likely invented. I remained skeptical and honestly paid little attention to their claims. I didn't feel the urgency to help them, especially since we had some personal differences and I hadn't even visited this new house they had moved into. That's how I ended up sharing everything with my partner while we were patrolling the city. He told me I was making a mistake by ignoring everything my parents said, especially since they were living with my sister. She had also shared paranormal experiences she had in the house. Some of the stories sounded like scenes from a horror movie, and she even cried while telling me about them. He couldn't understand how I didn't show more sensitivity toward my family's desperation. My partner opened my eyes, and within a few days I called my parents and told them I'd found the perfect house for them. They said they were going to sell the old one and made a deal with the owners to pay it in very reasonable installments. On the day of the move, my mother called and told me she had left some boxes in her room. Since no one else wanted to go back, she asked me if I could help. I told my partner about it before my shift ended, and he suggested I go. He said he would wait for me at the station and would come up with any excuse if anyone asked. I thanked him and went to the house to do the favor for my mother. I went in relaxed, not feeling stressed or anxious. When I got to the door, I opened it with the keys my mother had left on the rug and went inside. The house was beautiful, and I loved the finishes. For a moment, I even considered buying it. I called my mom, asked her where the room was, and she gave me the details since the place was enormous. I went up the stairs, entered the correct room, and saw the boxes on my mom's bed. But then I noticed something strange. One of the boxes was open, and the contents were scattered around. It was odd that they'd left it like that without picking things up, but I didn't think too much of it. I just gathered the items, took the first box downstairs and put it in the back of the patrol car. When I went back to grab the second box, I started hearing noises coming from the second floor. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but no one answered. Instinctively, I placed my hand on my weapon. Then I heard a woman's voice calling my name. I began climbing the stairs slowly, ready for anything. As I reached the hallway separating the rooms, I was shocked to see that the box, which had been on my mom's bed, was now on the floor again, next to the door. There was no way it could have moved just from a breeze. That was when I realized I was not alone in the house. Suddenly, I heard many voices talking, laughing, and shouting. I drew my weapon and held it firmly. I called out again to see if anyone would answer, and in the distance I saw the figure of a man watching me from one of the rooms. He was dressed in dirty, torn clothes. I immediately shouted at him to stay still and raise his hands, but he ignored me and continued staring. I couldn't see his face clearly because it was so dark, but I could tell he was smiling. At that moment, the door in front of him slammed shut with an incredible force, and I had no idea how it didn't break. Throughout all this, the voices didn't stop. They kept calling my name. Then something I couldn't see grabbed my foot, causing me to fall and hit my head. I couldn't escape as it dragged me through the hallway, smashing me into the wall. Somehow I gathered the strength to stand up and make my way to the door. But just before I reached it, I heard multiple voices laughing simultaneously, as if one single entity was causing it. There were also insults being shouted in deep voices, but the words were unintelligible. Fortunately, I managed to escape the house. I immediately went to my parents' new house and they took me to the hospital. I had to tell the authorities that thieves were responsible for what happened, because no one would have believed the real story. At the end of the day, only my family was there for me. From that moment on, I understood them. They had been telling the truth. Something dark was lingering in that house, and I knew there was no explanation. I couldn't risk exposing another family to such danger. That's why we decided to demolish the house, hoping that nothing dark would ever return there again. As a police officer, I've encountered unique situations where both my colleagues and superiors have helped me continue in this line of work, but at the same time they've put me in such controversial circumstances that it made me question whether we are truly capable of fighting the real evil in the world. We can't be everywhere, and that night I realized that when faced with the unknown, we can do nothing but watch and move on with our lives. It happened one evening while I was patrolling the streets of the city around 10 p.m., My partner was incredibly sick with a high fever, having spent the previous night at the hospital in an environment he absolutely hated. I thought it must have been something serious for him to go there. As I drove, we talked and he joked around, asking if I needed him, and all of that distracted me, at least for a while. Then the patrol radio crackled, notifying me of an emergency call from a house. A woman was allegedly suffering from domestic violence at the hands of her partner. They gave me the address and urged me to go there immediately. I floored the gas pedal, determined to get there as quickly as possible. Just minutes away from reaching the house, I got a call from the station informing me that something didn't add up. Apparently, the woman who called had been listed as dead for several days. Nothing made sense, but still, I decided to go to the house. On the way there, a colleague at the station informed me that the woman's body had never been found during the investigation. Her death had been declared based solely on her husband's testimony. I couldn't understand the case. Without a body, they couldn't just consider her dead based on what the husband claimed. They should have arrested him as the prime suspect. But I didn't want to start playing detective while driving, especially at that speed. My colleague warned me to be cautious. Before I arrived, she suggested that if anything felt off or out of the ordinary, I should call for backup immediately. She reassured me that she'd be ready to send support as soon as I asked. I agreed, and it gave me a small sense of security, knowing someone in the station cared so much for us officers. I finally arrived at the house. It was a beautiful 2-story white house with a well-kept garden. I rang the doorbell and almost instantly, I heard a woman's voice from inside telling me to come in. However, the house was completely dark. Something told me that entering was a very bad idea, but my curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to go in, armed and with a flashlight in hand. I checked room by room, completely silent, with a heavy sense of unease. The atmosphere felt ominous and I felt tense, unsure of what was happening. Everything seemed strange and illogical. The woman had said to come in, but then stopped speaking entirely. I assumed she was being threatened by her husband to remain silent and not make a sound, but I decided to continue investigating. Suddenly I heard hollow thumps coming from the second floor, likely from one of the rooms. I cautiously opened each room one by one, trying to find the source of the noise, but all of them were empty until I reached the last room. Again I heard the thumps. I entered that final room prepared to find the husband and the woman bound and needing help, but once again, the room was empty. The entire house was deserted, and although the sounds came from there was no one to be seen. That's when I heard the thumping again, followed by the sound of a woman crying, but it came from behind a wall. The woman was sobbing uncontrollably, in great pain. I was struck by the situation and immediately searched for something to break through the wall. After a while, I managed to create a hole, and a foul stench hit me instantly. The rotting smell was unbearable, and there behind the wall was the decomposing body of a poor woman. I quickly called for backup and alerted my colleague at the station, explaining the situation. Patrol cars arrived, followed by the team, to remove the body. It turned out to be the missing woman. They found signs of strangulation on her body and skin under her nails that, after further investigation, were confirmed to be from her husband. This was enough to build a case, and he eventually confessed to everything he had done. He was convicted, and justice was served. However, I spent many sleepless nights thinking about how it was possible to hear the cries of a woman who had already passed away, and how she could strike the wall, asking for help and demanding the justice she deserved. It was a phone call that should have been impossible, but it happened nonetheless. I remember how a simple phone call completely changed the way my partner and I view the world. The unknown is overwhelming, and what man understands leaves no room for doubt, especially after what we experienced. We were at the station when I received a call on my personal number. A man, speaking in a desperate tone, told me he was in grave danger. He mentioned my name, my partner's name, and even our families. I immediately understood the seriousness of the situation and listened closely to his words. He didn't threaten me, but rather, it felt like he wanted me to keep everything confidential. He gave me an address and said he needed us to come there, but that he didn't need our help. Then he hung up. I told my partner about the call and advised him to stay close to the radio. We agreed that we might need to call for backup at any moment. On our way to the address, we called our families to make sure they were safe, and fortunately, they were. The only thing left was figuring out what this man wanted, and how he had obtained not just my number, but all the information about us. When we arrived at the house, we didn't even have to knock. The door opened as soon as we stepped onto the porch. We entered, and immediately heard the man's voice calling us. He was sitting in the living room facing a table with a Ouija board on it. His hand was resting on the board, and as soon as we approached, he told us not to remove it, or terrible things would happen in the house. My partner and I exchanged skeptical glances, thinking it was probably a very poor joke. But it was him who walked up to the man and, without any respect, told him that if he kept playing these games, things would go badly for him. He then ordered the man to stand up and come with us to the station. The man refused, saying it wasn't possible. At that point, my partner lost his composure and patience. He grabbed the Ouija board and pulled it off the table, along with the man's hand. Seconds later, something we couldn't see struck the man, slamming him into the wall behind him. I drew my weapon, but I had no idea who or what to aim at. I looked at my partner, who was gasping for air. Whatever it was that struck him had its grip around his throat with unimaginable force. I could see his skin being squeezed. It had to be some kind of ghost or malevolent spirit. I tried to help him, but then I was struck in the face in the same way, left dazed and lying on the floor. When I got up, I grabbed the Ouija board and placed it back on the table. The man immediately put his hand back on it. My partner was freed from the grip around his throat and started struggling to refill his lungs with air. I rushed to his side, and we both quickly understood that the man wasn't lying. He couldn't separate himself from the board. When my partner recovered, he asked the man why he had called us if we couldn't fight something like that. The man confessed that on the second floor of the house he had his baby, and he needed us to take her out of the house because, in his words, he was already a lost cause. My partner went upstairs and came down with the little girl in his arms. The man told us to leave, explaining that the pact he had made had to be fulfilled, and asked us to take the child to her grandparents. We left the house, and seconds later, we heard a terrible, gut-wrenching scream. That day, the man disappeared, and he was never seen or found again. We sent the baby to her grandparents, just as he had asked, and we never spoke of that strange and paranormal case again. I worked as a police officer for several decades in Mexico, and that experience far exceeds all the horrible things I witnessed during my years of service. I am finally sharing this story because it happened over 20 years ago, but I still tell it with great respect and a chill running down my spine when I remember it. Back then, I was working with my patrol partner, Lydia. We were not only work colleagues but also good friends, and this story is something I've never shared before. It was a cold October night, and I remember it very clearly because a powerful storm was on the way. The thunder was deafening and lightning lit up the sky. We had just bought hamburgers for dinner in the patrol car, thinking the night was going to be calm, but suddenly everything changed. At around 11 p.m. we received an urgent call. There wasn't much information. The dispatcher only told us that a woman had called 911, though she could barely be understood due to her sobbing. The only thing that was clear was that her nephew was badly injured. We rushed to the address because we were close by, and we were the first to arrive. The rain was pouring down heavily, and the thunder kept intensifying, which added a layer of drama and fear to the already terrifying situation. I remember Lydia knocked on the door, announcing that we were the police. A woman in her 30s, covered in red stains on her hands and clothes, opened the door crying and pleading for help. As we entered the house, we saw a 6-year-old boy, unconscious, lying in the living room. I won't go into explicit details out of respect for the child, but the scene was horrendous beyond words. Then, we heard the ambulance sirens. They rushed in to try and help the child, while we questioned the woman about what had happened, asking who had caused such an atrocity. Through her tears, the woman said she was the boy's aunt. We asked if there was another child in the house, and she said yes, her 11-year-old niece whom her sister had left in her care. The mother worked late nights, so the aunt had come over to stay with the kids. She told us that when she entered the house, she witnessed something she couldn't process. Her niece had been hurting her nephew with a kitchen knife. The woman said that her niece's face had changed, and she looked like a completely different person. She described her face as demonic, with a wicked and unsettling smile, unlike anything she had seen before. The aunt was in shock, and when she screamed at her niece to stop, asking what she was doing, the girl just kept smiling in that terrifying way. Then, out of nowhere, the niece turned to look at her brother on the floor, and her expression shifted. The little girl immediately ran upstairs and locked herself in her room. The woman said she didn't dare to go after her, because she was afraid of what had just happened. The paramedics soon informed us that the boy had no vital signs and was beyond saving. The woman began to cry uncontrollably, a heartbreaking sight. Now we had to go upstairs to check on the girl. We had to interrogate her and verify the story the woman had told. Lydia and I went upstairs to the only room that was locked. Lydia knocked on the door and gently spoke to the girl, asking her to come out. We thought that maybe, being a woman, Lydia could gain her trust more easily. She told the girl that she just wanted to talk and that nothing bad would happen to her, but the girl didn't respond. We tried to force the door open, but we didn't want to break it down and scare the child. As we struggled with the door, a voice suddenly came from inside. It wasn't the voice of a child, but a deep male voice that sounded almost sinister. It was then that we began to worry. We thought someone else might be in the room, perhaps holding the girl hostage, so we decided to break down the door. When we entered, the first thing we saw was the girl sitting on the floor staring at us. Her eyes were locked onto us, and her smile, oh, that smile, was something I can't even describe. A child of her age shouldn't have had that much malice in her eyes, that wicked grin. It was exactly as the aunt had described. Lydia asked the girl if she was okay, and if anyone else was in the room, but the girl didn't answer. She just kept smiling at us, her expression frozen in that sinister way. I began inspecting the room, which was small and sparse. There was no one else in there. There wasn't even a TV or anything that could have emitted that disturbing male voice we had heard. The only window had bars, so there was no way anyone could have escaped. It was just her alone. At that point, both Lydia and I were incredibly confused. It was clear to us now that the girl was the one who had made that frightening laugh. Lydia cautiously approached her, but the girl suddenly sprang up and charged at her. That's when I had to intervene. The girl was kicking and screaming, trying to escape, so we had to wrestle her down. It was one of the toughest things I ever had to do as a police officer. The girl had red stains all over her clothes, hands and feet. It was obvious that she had been involved in what had happened to her brother. We also found the kitchen knife discarded under her closet. The girl was taken into custody for questioning, as was her aunt. Her mother was later notified of the incident, and it was confirmed that the girl had committed the crime. She even confessed, but what she said next left everyone in shock. "He made me do it." Psychological tests were done, and the girl showed no signs of mental illness or psychological disorders, so no one could explain why she did what she did. When asked why she had committed such an act, she simply repeated, "He made me do it." We then learned from the girl's aunt that the children's mother had recently started dating a man who had introduced her to satanic rituals. This man convinced her that performing these rituals would make them both rich, and they would be able to move away to another country. Since that man entered their lives, the girl's behavior had changed drastically. She became aggressive, started using foul language, and experienced mood swings. The aunt also mentioned that the girl had often been heard talking to someone in her room, but when they checked, no one was ever there. Strange things began to happen at the house. Plates would fall off the shelves at night, and there were eerie noises that couldn't be explained. The mother eventually admitted to practicing these rituals, often at night after work. There were even books on rituals and voodoo dolls found in the house. In conclusion, the girl was sent to a juvenile facility, and her mother was released. I never heard of the case again, but it remains one of the most paranormal experiences I've ever had. Lydia and I will never forget that night, that child's eyes filled with rage and cynicism, and that twisted smile. Maybe the girl was possessed by a demon, which is why she did what she did. As I mentioned, she passed all the psychological tests, and she herself confessed that he made me do it. What really happened that night? I leave it up to you to decide. Here is the translated and reworded version of your text. I've never hesitated to confront hitmen, criminals, thieves, or anyone mentally unstable. I've always been prepared to handle those situations if necessary. But there was one time when my partner and I didn't know what we were up against. We were paralyzed with fear and shocked by the gruesome scene we witnessed. It seemed like any other night. We had just left our favorite bakery. Everything was calm. No reports, no emergency calls. I was driving while my partner talked to me about his relationship. It seemed like he was thinking of breaking up, as they'd been arguing a lot lately. I knew the real reason was because he had been unfaithful. I kept telling him he would eventually face the consequences, but he kept saying he'd leave it to karma, and that he prayed to God every night asking for forgiveness. I knew that wasn't how it worked, but I didn't waste my time trying to make him understand. That's when we got the call. It was a distress signal very close to where we were. A man had apparently been attacked in the middle of the road, and a witness had made the call before fleeing and disappearing. The clock read 10 p.m. It was odd that something like this would happen on a road with no one intervening. We thought the attacker must have had some kind of dangerous weapon, so we prepared ourselves. I wish someone had warned us about what we were about to see. It may sound cowardly, but had I known, I wouldn't have gone to that call, and I'm sure my partner wouldn't have either. We arrived on the road, and from a distance we could see a body on the ground with something dark on top of it. I floored the gas pedal and stopped about 8 meters away. That's when we saw it. It wasn't a man on top of the body. It was something or some kind of animal unlike anything I've ever seen. It had black fur, resembling a giant wolf, but its appearance was horrifying. Its limbs were abnormally long, and its snout was buried in the body, which was clearly lifeless. I couldn't even look at my partner. I stood frozen in place. The creature kept moving the body, tearing at the skin. The whole area was covered in blood. I drew my weapon, as it was clear we had to act, but my partner stopped me, grabbing my arm and telling me that if the bullets couldn't kill that thing, we would be next. He was right, but I felt helpless. The idea of letting it go made me angry, knowing it could harm others and we might not get to them in time. Just then we got a call from dispatch, and without hesitation, we called for backup, explaining that we were dealing with a huge beast. That's when we received the order to shoot immediately. My partner was still refusing, but then he let go of me and said that if I got out of the car, he would lock the door behind me so I couldn't come back in. He wasn't going to risk his life for a corpse that creature was devouring. I aimed and without hesitation emptied the magazine, confident that the shots would land. The bullets pierced its skin, and then it ran off, leaving a trail of blood that the backup followed when they arrived. A short time later, the trail led them to an alley where it suddenly vanished without explanation. On the ground, there were the spent bullets I had fired, but no body in sight. I couldn't understand what had happened to the creature, or why the bullets were left behind with no body to show for it. At the station, they decided to close the case. They claimed the man on the road was just a homeless person. It didn't seem right to me to leave it at that, but deep down I wanted to forget everything that happened, and it seemed like my superiors did too. In the end, everything was swept under the rug in a closed file. And those were today's stories. Did you like any of them? Comment on which one you liked and tell us if you've ever experienced something like this in your life. Don't forget to like, and I hope to see you in the next video, if you have the courage to watch more stories.